lasy głębiej, umknij zwierzu z drogi nam. To taczanka wroga pędzi, to taczanka wroga gna. W bystrym pędzie bije z lotu, śmiało idzie w gęsty bój. Zagrzechocze z kulomiotu, wojowniku młody mój. Hej, taczanka rostowianka, twoja piękność oczy rwie.
Konnej armii tyś kochanka, 4 litry koła twe.
Hej, taczanka rostowianka, twoja piękność oczy rwie.
Konnej armii tyś kochanka, 4 litry koła twe.
Hej za Wołgą, hej za Donem, gdzie po stepie tętnik spał. Ogorzały, zakurzony, celowniczy młody gnał. Mknie taczanka, któż ją wstrzyma, rwie za końską grzywą w trop. Grzywa wichru, grzywa dymu, grzywa burzy ognia snop. Hej, taczanka rostowianka, twoja piękność oczy rwie.
Konnej armii tyś kochanka, 4 litry koła twe.
Hej, taczanka rostowianka, twoja piękność oczy rwie.
Konnej armii tyś kochanka, 4 litry koła twe.
Marczą groźnie nasze tanki, płyną pieśni spoza chmur. Słabe wartki, kół taczanki, gra motorów szumny chór. I do dzisiaj wróg pamięta, jak to nogi brał za pas. Mknie taczanka dumna, piękna i wojownik młody nasz. Hej, taczanka rostowianka, twoja piękność oczy rwie.
Konnej armii tyś kochanka, 4 litry koła twe.
Hej, taczanka rostowianka, twoja piękność oczy rwie.
Konnej armii tyś kochanka, 4 litry koła twe.
Nie Panu wysługiwać się, nie broni wspierać bramy, wolności ludu broni swe, czerwony Bóg Warszawy. Nie otumają słowa nas, z pałacu przyznał wody, że wolni znak prowadzi nas, to sztandar nasz czerwony. Hej, towarzysze, naprzód masz, zagłodnych mas miliony, wyzwoli braci podnioszasz, Warszawy Bóg czerwony. Wysoko zniesie sztandar swój, radosny sztandar bramy. I ruszy bój śmiertelny mój, czerwony Bóg Warszawy. Nie szepczą Polska święta rzecz, więc polskim panom służyć i mocno krew, a pański miecz na dobra kraju użyć. A my okrzykiem brawa, roboczej krwi złamiony, od naszych nam wszak staje Pan i wali wasze trony. Hej, towarzysze, naprzód marsz, zagodnych mas milion.
dzień zapłaty. Sędziami wówczas będziemy my, sędziami wówczas będziemy my.
Dalej więc, znieśmy śmierć.
Nasz sztandar płynie ponad trony, niesie on zemsty grom.
Ludu gniew,
Przyszłości rzucając się, a kolor jego jest czerwony, bo na nim robotnicza krew.
bo na nim robotnicza krew. Porządek stary już się wali, żywotem dla nas jego zgon. Będziemy wspólnie pracowali i wspólny będzie pracy plan. I wspólny będzie pracy plan. Dalej jest, znieśmy śpiew. Nasz sztandar płynie ponad trony.
Niesie on zemsty grom,
Ludu gniew,
przyszłości rzucając się.
a kolor jego jest czerwony, bo na nim robotnicza krew. Bo na nim robotnicza krew.
Precz z tyranami, precz z dziercami, niech zginie stary podły świat. My nowe życie stworzymy sami i nowy zaprowadzimy ład. I nowy zaprowadzimy ład.
Dalej więc, znieśmy śpiew.
Nasz sztandar płynie ponad trony, niesie on zemsty grom.
Ludu gniew,
Przyszłości rzucając się, a kolor jego jest czerwony, bo na nim robotnicza krew.
bo na nim robotnicza krew. Gdzie dom powstaje, pędzi maszyna i piec hutniczy strzela płomienie. Gdzie się nowa wielka zaczyna, ty jesteś patriona tchnieniem.
Tyś nauczyła nas pracować i życie dać na kraju. Prawda, że z partią naszą żołać, tę mogę ponad nas.
Tyś nauczyła nas pracować i życie dać nam kraju.
как он был от нас далек, как в костре под душем таял уголек. Были версты, обгорелые в пыли, этот день мы приближали, как могли. Этот день победы, город прав. Это праздник, сединой на висках. Это радость со слезами на глазах. День победы, день победы, день победы.
Jasny dzień zwycięstwa i biały bez brzmią saluty i sztandary chylą się, wielka radość, ale oczy pełne łez. Dzień zwycięstwa, dzień zwycięstwa, dzień zwycięstwa.
Witaj, mamo, powróciłem z wojny zdrów, ale inni już nie wrócą nigdy tu. Ślady bitew, deszcz wiosenny z twarzy zmył, przybliżaliśmy ten dzień ze wszystkich sił. W jasny dzień zwycięstwa kwitnie biały bez, grzmią saluty i sztandary chylą się. Wielka radość, ale oczy pełne łez. Dzień zwycięstwa, dzień zwycięstwa, dzień zwycięstwa.
To dzień pobiedy, orwan prawa. Ewa plastik, сединой на висках. Это радость со слезами на глазах. День победы, день победы, день победы.
I naród do boju wystąpił z orężem, panowie oczyli szafraci. I naród zawołał umrzem lub zwyciężym, panowie w stolicy bawili. O cześć wam, panowie magnaci, za naszą niewolę kajdany. O cześć wam, książęta, hramiowie prałaci, za kraj nasz kroklatnią zbryzgany. O cześć wam, panowie magnaci, za naszą niewolę kajdany. O cześć wam, książęta, hramiowie prałaci, za kraj nasz kroklatnią zbryzgany.
pracy nie. SP, hej, SP, polską przyszłość widzi w niej. SP, hej, SP, dalej z nami fundamenty kłaść, porwać Polski nowy. Maszeruje, rozśpiewana brać, przyszłości świat tęczowy. Dalej z nami fundamenty kłaść, porwać Polski nowy. Maszeruje, rozśpiewana brać, przyszłości świat tęczowy. Zmiata zgniłych czasów nie. SP, hej, SP, znika wyzysk, ból i gniew. Gdzie idzie SP? Służba Polsce, święty sztandar nasz, celem dobro ludu. I nad Odrą czujnie trzyma straż, pracy dokona cudów. Służba Polsce, święty sztandar nasz, celem dobro ludu. I nad Odrą czujnie trzyma straż, pracy dokona cudów. Spoza gór i rzek wyszliśmy na brzeg. Przystąd niedaleko już do grających wież malowanych zbóż. Wczoraj ład, mundur dziś, ściśnij pas, pora iść. Ruszaj, pierwszy korpus nasz, spoza gór i rzek na zachód masz. Czekaj, Maryś nas, niedaleki czas, gdy złona przepadnie zła, będzie radość aż pryśnie wokół za. Nie patrz, Maryś, nie powtórzy się. Ruszaj, pierwszy korpus nasz, spoza gór i rzek na zachód masz. Będzie wielka rzecz, pospolita rzecz, potęga wyrośnie z nas, na pochwałę wsi, na pochwałę miast, na spotkanie dnią, szlaki stanie dom. Ruszaj, pierwszy korpus nasz, zalutaj na wschód, na zachód masz. Na zachód masz.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I hope you were all enjoying the selection of Polish communist tunes there. I managed to put those together over the course of today because I knew we had Polish-related questions. So those were some tunes from the Polish People's Republic and the era of socialism in Poland, which I know we have questions on. So, hello to everybody. I hope you can hear me all right. Hope you enjoyed the Polish warm-up. It seems to have provoked some strong responses in the discussion group already. So I'm just going to say hello to everybody in the chat. So hello to Dingo Ate Me Baby. Only Polish song that you apparently know is Stolza, the birthday song. Well, that's more than I know. Apparently there's now a hunger for cheese pierogies. Well, there's a cafe just up the road from me that's is actually a Polish cafe, but I have a strong suspicion the guy is a bit of a reactionary who runs it, given the whole place is covered with photos of various occupants of the papacy. And here we go. So, we've got a question on communism in Poland. I'll come back to your question later on, Sardino. James Graham says, we had Polish sea trout imported from the Vistula and introduced into Loch Lomond in 1960s. Downstream is Vale of Leven, a.k.a. Little Moscow. Interesting fact. Red Star Betty, good evening to you. She's over the moon. It's Eastern European week at local supermarket. The herring is an underrated dish, I will say that. Good evening to Jerry. Good evening to Lee Hinchcliffe over there in Sheffield. Wrong side of the Pennines, but I'm sure we can work past it. Peter, hello to you. Red Star Betty says, Polish music is very uplifting and cheerful. Prompted strongly to want to sing along, but haven't a clue what I'm singing about. Well, no, don't let that stop you. Bono has built a whole career on not knowing what the fuck he's singing about, and look where he is now. Doing gigs in a Kiev subway. Irish Partisan like the music of the Polish People's Republic. Good evening to my comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project. Good evening to Jonah, and hello to HM down there in Brighton. Right, I have a number of questions that have come in through various mediums over the last few hours, so going to be working through those, and of course feel free to throw your own in, throw follow-up questions in on the chat, and we will begin. So, this first question came in from Brian J. This was the first one in. And this is, of course, a question related to revisionism. And question reads as follows. I wanted to ask about revisionism. I can't even pronounce it. It's so awful. About revisionism in the context of Marx Engels Lenin Institute's political education component. What exactly is the definition of revisionism when it comes to Marxism? And what are some things to keep in mind to avoid it going forward? Well, thanks to Brian for the question. So revisionism, I will summarize it as quickly as I can. I think the thing about revisionism that defines all of the aspects that have manifested themselves over the last 70 years, particularly since the Khrushchev secret speech, about which there are more to be said later, is its central component is the denial of the class struggle continuing after the revolution and the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Like last night, we were talking about Stalin's work from 1907 entitled Anarchism or Socialism, and his defense of the dictatorship of the proletariat in that. One of the key aspects of revisionism, both from Khrushchev and from Deng Xiaoping and others, including the Euro-communists, is this denial of, first of all, Mao's insight, and of course Stalin's as well, that class struggle was to continue after the revolution, and Mao's insight that it would in fact intensify as the proletariat struggled for supremacy over the old ruling class, but also continued a struggle against the influence of the bourgeoisie, the imperialist bourgeoisie in this case. So the Khrushchevites and later the Dengists denied that this was a necessity, and in fact both of them started to come up with formulations that argued that that class struggle was no longer in existence, that it was no longer necessary, that those who preached about the need for it were damaging the revolution. Like Khrushchev came up with this ridiculous theory about the Soviet Union being a state of the whole people. It wasn't the dictatorship of the proletariat anymore. It was a state of the whole people. Class struggle was over. Everybody was working together for the building of socialism. That was Khrushchev's formulation. Then later, this was subject to, I think, quite a fierce back and forth within the Soviet Party. So then you later get Brezhnev's slightly more compromised formulations that then weren't really Brezhnev's. It was the fact that the Khrushchev era, his attempted revisionism, did produce a backlash, I think, within the Soviet Party. And then you ended up with more left-sounding, more proletarian-sounding language in the later Brezhnev era. So key thing is denial of the intensification of class struggle after the revolution, denial of the importance of the preservation and the strengthening of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and seeking to avoid the necessity of mobilizing the masses inside the socialist countries. So like Khrushchev and others like him, like Deng Xiaoping, etc., don't want to mobilize the masses in support of the revolution. They don't want the masses to have an active role in the revolution. And this, of course, leads to bureaucratism. It leads to more and more opportunist trends evolving inside the party and the state. And that is, in my view, the essence of revisionism. It's also the denial of the contradictions in the world that cannot be resolved. So, for instance, the central contradiction being US imperialism and its role. One of the things you notice about both the Soviet and the Chinese revisionists is that they seek to deny, or at least they did until quite recently in China, they seek to deny the inevitable conflict with imperialism. Like Khrushchev started off by saying that I'm such a clever guy that I can make a deal with imperialism. And then because he was that classic sort of opportunist, he would like swing between wildly, apparently different positions. Like he'd go from saying, well, we can make a bargain with imperialism, we can get them to respect our interests and we will respect theirs. This is the same thing that Gorbachev came out with in his book Perestroika 30 years later. And I can bargain with them. Then, of course, the imperialists basically told him to fuck off, as they were always going to, and that they weren't going to concede anything. And remember, Hungary in 1956, Khrushchev didn't want to intervene. He wanted to let events play out because he thought that it would strengthen his hand with regard to negotiating with the imperialists if he let the counter-revolutionary forces triumph in Hungary, which of course they were counter-revolutionary forces. The core component of them were fascists and fascist sympathizers. So he thought that if he let that just play itself out, that would win him points with the imperialists. Of course, the imperialists aren't stupid. They understand, the bourgeoisie understand, the class interests they're advancing and defending. And they know very well that the existence of the socialist camp was absolutely unacceptable to them, and it absolutely had to be destroyed as a priority for them, because if a gigantic area of the world, around about a third of the world at least, remained off limits for hyper-exploitation, then imperialism didn't have much of a future. And so their pressure on the Soviet Union and all socialist countries was, of course, relentless. Khrushchev and later Gorbachev didn't understand that at all because, of course, these were people with an abysmal understanding of Marxism and Leninism. It's said that Khrushchev barely read any of either. He read a few necessary things to make it sound as if he knew what he was talking about, but Mao reported after a conversation with Khrushchev in the mid-50s that Khrushchev had an appalling understanding of Marxism and an even worse understanding of imperialism. Like, he just didn't understand it at all. Like, it's a classic bureaucrat thing, not just in terms of Soviet bureaucracy, but if you listen to, like, so-called moderate trade union leaders, what they'll often come out and say is like, well, we've just had a misunderstanding with the management. We just need to understand the management's position, and then they will understand ours, and we can come to an accommodation. And it's the same with like the likes of Khrushchev or Gorbachev, because these people are opportunists. They are not Marxists at all. They always come out with this crap about, well, we need to understand each other's interests. If we understand the Americans' interests, and they will understand ours. This is how revisionists talk, because they refuse, whether they are trade union bureaucrats or whether they are leaders of potentially very powerful socialist states, they refuse to see the class conflict on the international scale for what it is, or on the scale of one workplace, which is a clash of fundamentally irreconcilable interests. And Khrushchev didn't want to admit to that. And in the end, he then swung in the other direction as he was forced to over the events in Cuba, and eventually was forced out. Gorbachev, unfortunately, was not forced out because, again, the revisionists had allowed the rot to creep all the way through a lot of the state structures and the economy and the party. So that's the basis of revisionism. The basis of revisionism is the denial of the need for class struggle inside socialist countries, the denial that it intensifies per Mao's observation, the denial of the vital nature and the absolute necessity of maintaining and strengthening the dictatorship of the proletariat, the denial of the role of the masses, and that the masses need to be continually involved in the running of the economy and the state. And of course, this is what's done in the socialist countries that have survived, those that are on a much more socialist path, like the DPRK or Cuba as well. But they survive because of the close involvement of the masses in the system. And the same is true of like Venezuela or Nicaragua, which are not socialist countries as yet. These are still countries with elements of capitalism within them, but they are undergoing a revolutionary process which is leading them towards socialism in many respects, and that is being powered by the mass involvement of the proletariat and peasantry in those countries in that revolutionary process. And the revisionists are always those who seek to deny it, seek to do things bureaucratically, seek to do shoddy bargains with the imperialists whenever the opportunity arises, because they think that they can gain some kind of social peace where they can basically use that breathing space to advance their interests, to advance the interests of the bit of the bureaucracy that they're attached to, or the pro-capitalist faction that they're attached to. So that is my summing up of revisionism, and I'll say that China's been run by revisionists for a long time. Evidence of that would be the attitude of first Deng Xiaoping and then Jiang Zemin towards the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that they both sought to weaken it. And Jiang Zemin pulled a Khrushchev around about 20 years ago now, and he ushered in what he termed, basically similar term to Khrushchev, a state of all the people. Again, denying the necessity of class struggle, trying to get away from that insight of Chairman Mao's. And they'll be forced to go back on that before too long, I think, because the class struggle does exist in China and will intensify in China with the presence of capitalists. And you don't need to go too far to find stories of class struggle in China at the moment. And of course, it is under the influence of a strengthening wave of class struggle that the Chinese party changed its line on quite a number of different things with the arrival of Xi Jinping in the General Secretaryship. So I hope that answers your question. The definition of revisionism, of course, could be expanded. I'm happy to do more on the question should people demand it. So hello to Ben, who comments, a pillar of Duce compelling to me is commitment to self-reliance, not isolationist, but having foundation of 100% self-sufficiency. In my opinion, should be a major part of UK communist programme. Thoughts? I completely agree with Ben's comment now. The way in which that we should look to develop our economies when we get to the stage of having a planned economy is that we should look to maximize our self-reliance. As Ben puts it, it's not about completely sealing yourself off from the world, but about the maximum development of the resources of your country, partly because there is an economic necessity there. You may be under siege, you may be under attack from the imperialists, you may need that full maximization of your economic resources in order to survive, but also from the perspective of the development of the class in terms of the proletariat playing a role in the mass industrialization of the country, seeing that how much can be achieved internally in the development of the economy will strengthen the proletariat's belief in the building of socialism. If we're getting everything fucking imported from overseas, that's not going to strengthen the belief of the domestic proletariat in the system. what that's going to do is that's going to weaken people's belief. And you can, and the DPRK is a fine example of this, as is the revolutionary periods in Russia and China. You can develop a huge amount in what is regarded as unproductive land, unproductive areas to build anything, industries that we're told we can't have under capitalism because, of course, it goes against the profit motive. Developing all of those things that the proletariat has been told by bourgeois politicians for generations we can't have in this country anymore. Like, we can't have, for instance, a strong car industry. We can't have a strong domestic manufacturing base at all. Seeing that all of that can be done, seeing that we can maximally develop the farmland in the country to feed ourselves, and we can sustain ourselves with healthy food without the need for external imports, that is a crucial part of a planned economy in any country. So in Britain, we've got the agricultural potential to feed ourselves. We just don't use it because so much of the land is signed over to the leisure usage of the rich, grouse shooting, fox hunting, that kind of thing. So yes, completely agree with Ben's point there. So moving away from revisionism, more on to other questions. So this one comes from Irish Partisan, who I believe is in the chat. So what's your opinion on Bitcoin and Bukele in El Salvador? If you don't know who this is Nayib Bukele. He's the so-called populist president of El Salvador. He gained some notoriety for doing some kind of action regarding gang warfare in El Salvador by locking up hundreds and hundreds of them, possibly thousands of them, in new prison complexes. This, of course, gained in popularity with people who were sick of the gang warfare in the streets. Others said that what he'd actually done is struck a deal with the more powerful gangs to lock up their rivals. And others still said that the whole thing was a put-up job. Needless to say, I don't know what the reality with regard to that is. I haven't done enough research on it. But he has a degree of popularity that came from at least the perception that he was tackling the crime problem. Of course, El Salvador was the subject of a vicious genocidal campaign unleashed by the United States back in the 1980s. It's the subject of an Oliver Stone movie, actually, called Salvador, starring James Woods, of all people. Would you believe it? But the question over Bukele and what he's done with Bitcoin is an interesting one because, of course, he's declared Bitcoin to be legal tender there, exciting all the various different cranks and Bitcoin maniacs on the internet. I'd say this about Bitcoin. Bitcoin's a classic case of people looking for a solution to a real problem, which is the steady devaluation of currencies over time. And, of course, the fact that the currency becomes more and more devalued by the fact that the capitalist class just keeps printing money digitally this time to cover up the vast problems that were thoroughly exposed in the 2008 to 2010 recession and which are returning now because they've never gone away. So a group of libertarian types decided they were going to basically try and start their own currency in order to escape the control of the central banks, because central banking is like one of the big bugbears of libertarianism. And the idea being that you can escape this control by having your own currency. And then, of course, Bukele adopts it in El Salvador. I'd say it's a classic case of misdiagnosing the problem, the digital currencies. The problem with the central banks and the problem with the vast printing of currency isn't that the central bank's controlling everything, because it's not. It's the problem is that, of course, capitalism, because it continually devalues its currency over many, many years and keeps devaluing it precisely not because of some scheme by the central banks, but because of capitalism's crisis of profitability. And that's the big problem in the center of all of this. That's what causes, ultimately, the collapse of 2008, which causes them to print all this money and continually print all this money to this day. If you change over the currency to Bitcoin, you're not going to be able to escape the contradictions of capitalism. That's the big fantasy that a lot of libertarians have, that they're going to be able to escape it. Truth is, the reality of things like central bank digital currencies, full digitization, which is hovering around, like full replacement of cash, things like that. I don't think full replacement of cash is quite as far developed as some people think. That's just my personal take on it. But Bukele, yeah, he's pandering in many respects. He thought that by opening up to Bitcoin, he'd bring in a lot of these like Bitcoin fraudsters from the United States to base their businesses there. I don't know if it's had much success for him. If anything happens with digital currencies, it won't be Bitcoin. It'll be various central banks starting to issue them or issue digital currencies like the Zimbabweans are doing, issuing a digital currency backed with gold. So that's your that's the issue here. It's like the Bitcoin, like all the other, like, or Dogecoin or whatever the fuck is floating around Elon Musk's Twitter these days. All these things are based on an illusion. They're basically just giant pump and dump schemes, which blew up because, funnily enough, because of the gigantic amount of liquidity floating around in the system that had been pumped into it by the central banks. Therefore, a lot of people were holding on to this cash that they got hold of because, of course, the liquidity that was created by the central banks went to giant corporations often to buy up dollar bonds or mortgage-backed securities from them or buy up government debt. The companies then sat on this and didn't invest it because, of course, the rate of profit is too low. And then what they did with it when they boosted their share price by doing stock buybacks with this money they got from the central banks, the people who then got the cashed in their shares looked for something to put this in, and because Bitcoin itself had become a bubble, they put it in Bitcoin or they put it in Dogecoin and then cashed out of it. So the idea of Bitcoin being independent, its value became partially dependent upon the very central banks that its creators set it up to try and evade. So I think it's a scam. I think it's a fraud. The technology will ultimately used by central banks at some point to put in place a digital currency. They clearly want to do that to some degree. I don't think we're quite as close to it as some people think, though. So whether Bukele survives is going to be an interesting question, though. He may find that that the US wants to be friends with him again very quickly because they did have a bit of a falling out. I think that now the US is taking a much more aggressively reactionary, even more reactionary turn in terms of attacking any government that seeks to exert itself in its sovereignty, exert its sovereignty in Central and Southern America. Bukele will probably be brought back into the American fold if he ever really left it. So, pausing for comments. Ben says, despite the constraints of national resources, creativity unlocks many possibilities, especially, as you mentioned, the capabilities of the proletariat. It is inspiring and builds faith in ourselves and each other. Very true. Red Star Betty replying says, was talking to my sister last night who works in a mining-related area, says, we are absolutely should reopen coal mines, and she says we have coal for centuries, can be independent. Well, she's entirely correct. When we closed down, or we didn't, but when the bourgeoisie killed the coal industry in Britain, we were sitting on, I believe it was 1,000 years of coal reserves. And it's not that they stopped using coal. They kept bringing it in from initially Poland and then South Africa. So this is all a bit of a fucking joke, to be honest. Like, the idea that we were ever free of coal, like, it was a complete illusion. And they keep having to bring coal in because, of course, the energy grid keeps getting strained and they have to keep firing up coal-fired power stations. So the solution, in my mind, is we reinstitute coal-fired power stations for the intermediate period and then use that to provide us with a stopgap whilst we build up a fully nuclear-powered energy grid, basically. We would need to vastly expansion in our investment in nuclear power, and that would, of course, be a long-term project, so you'd use coal to fill in the meantime. But we never went off coal. I mean, it's been pushed down, but until like 20 years ago, still almost half the electricity in the country was being generated by it. This leads us into the area of climate change, which is, of course, the current bourgeois hysterical scare story. More on this to follow in future programs. Right. Jonah asks, in a hypothetical revolution in the USA, how to deal with drug addiction, substance abuse, anything we could learn from China's experience with opium? Okay, I'll come to your question at the end, okay? do we have metals in the UK, or can we recycle old cars, saucepans, etc.? A friend 30 years ago said would continue rant about importing coal from Australia. Yeah, imported coal from everywhere else. I mean, part of it was, of course, about profitability, but what you've got to understand is that a lot about eliminating coal in Britain was only partly about profit. The other big thing, and this is a financial hit the bourgeoisie were prepared to take, was they just wanted to exterminate the mining industry because the miners were the leading and most organized and militant section of the class, who were able, by dint of the fact that they were in a crucial position to exert industrial power, very difficult to tackle. And so how do you tackle them? Well, you get rid of them and you import everything. That's a big part of the reason why mining got shut down. So bear this in mind whenever some Tory starts droning on about green commitments. So, right. I'll move on to the next question then. Next question comes from David Green on Patreon. Do you have any reservations whatsoever in relation to Grover Furr's contributions to our understanding of the Soviet Union? Well, this is the point where I say Stalin did nothing wrong. Just putting it out there. But if you're not familiar with who Grover Furr is, he's an American historian. His speciality wasn't even Soviet history. His speciality, I believe, is medieval history, which he'd been a leader in the field of for many, many years. And I think he started writing about the Soviet Union in I believe it was the late 90s, early 2000s. His most famous book is Khrushchev Lied, which was a very, very thorough debunking of the so-called secret speech of Khrushchev, who we mentioned earlier, where he accused Stalin of all these things. The key element in his research is that he has access to, or was able to get access to, a lot of the archives of the former Soviet Union in the 90s and 2000s, and he now works with several Russian researchers in trawling through these. And he makes the claim in Khrushchev Lied that, like almost every single claim that Khrushchev makes, was either an outright lie or a wild exaggeration. And I think that his central claim there has been borne out over time, which is that Khrushchev, and I've read Khrushchev Lied all the way through, I've read it a couple of times, and his central thesis isn't that Stalin was some sort of living god who never made mistakes. Furr's central thesis in a lot of what he writes is that the bourgeois treatment of Stalin and, of course, Khrushchev's treatment of Stalin were all based on like lies and wild exaggerations. And I've read some of Furr's other work, including his work where he goes over the declassified records of Stalin's disputes within the party in the 30s over democratization. And you can see it's not that, again, that Furr is putting Stalin on some sort of pedestal. What he's seeking to do is to bring us a more realistic understanding of the situation in the Soviet Union in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s. So the question isn't whether Stalin did nothing wrong or not. I mean, that's a good meme, and it's a good comeback to annoy liberals with. But what Furr is trying to do in his work, and this is certainly true in Khrushchev Lied and other things, is that he's trying to draw out a much more three-dimensional view of the revolutionary process that was underway. And that's why I'd recommend you read his work on the struggle for democratization. And he is trying to issue a corrective to conventional bourgeois and revisionist views of Stalin. And he doesn't deny that the revolutionary process in the 20s and 30s was often brutal and often bloody, and that is something that we can't deny because it happened. I mean, if you look at the way that the bourgeois historians treat Stalin, though, it's always this diabolical figure sitting in the Kremlin, cackling away, ordering more Ukrainian peasants to be starved to death. Whereas in actual fact, of course, Stalin as the preeminent leader, but by no means the dictator, the preeminent leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, as they were called at the time, was somebody who was responding to class struggle and also then shaping class struggle. The party under Stalin did have continual engagement with the masses and continual back and forth with them. And that's why, of course, we find ourselves when we're looking at things like collectivization, whether you get the bourgeois historians and Khrushchev trying to say, oh, Stalin ordered it in a mad fit of whatever. And the Trotskyists, of course, say this as well. In reality, Stalin is responding to the situation on the ground in the countryside, where the peasantry is locked in a near civil war situation with the kulaks. And it is the peasantry moving against the kulaks which causes a crisis, because suddenly the Soviet Party is in a position where they have to either back the kulaks and continue the line of Bukharin, who said to the kulaks, enrich yourselves, or you back the landless peasants and you move to collectivization. And of course they move to collectivization and they back the landless peasants against the kulaks. And of course that leads to a struggle in the party between the supporters of the majority position led by Stalin and the right-wing opposition led by Bukharin, a struggle Bukharin loses. And that's the sort of picture that Furr and other historians now, people like Lazardo and his final work on Stalin, which is being released again in a very interesting new re-release coming out very soon, hoping to do something on that. So the question, the way in which Grover Furr's writing should be regarded is that he is doing a corrective to the Trotskyite view on Stalin, to the Khrushchevite view on Stalin, and the bourgeois view on Stalin. And that corrective is very valuable for communists, because how we should be examining the Soviet Union is through the lens of the unfolding revolutionary process, through the lens of the power of the proletariat and the power of the peasantry, and looking at how these elements of the urban and rural proletariat were in a continual process of engagement with the party and were shaping the party and the state. And it's the viciousness of the class struggle against the kulaks, and of course the campaign of imperialism to destroy the Soviet Union, which creates, of course, the purges in the 1930s, which Furr tackles, I think, fairly. And he does quote extensively from bourgeois sources of the time who were proclaiming that, for instance, that Bukharin later and the military conspirators and the Trotskyites, these people were all guilty of anti-Soviet conspiracies. And I think that Furr has comprehensively demonstrated, along with people like other Marxist historians like Ludo Martens, have demonstrated that there were anti-Soviet conspiracies being run inside the USSR by Trotsky's network of supporters. So this is the absolutely crucial thing to bear in mind here, that Stalin was somebody who was committed to proletarian power. He's committed to maintaining the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that is, of course, why he has so many enemies in bourgeois academia and Trotskyism. Because he remained a revolutionary and committed to the revolutionary line right up to the end of his life, as is evidenced by his final work on economic problems of socialism in the USSR. So yes, Furr's work is a very necessary corrective to the bourgeois and the Trotskyite narrative. I haven't read all of his stuff yet, but the next one on the list is his refutation of, I think it's Bloodlands. He's called it Blood Lies. So I'll be reading that next. But thanks to David for the question. Now pause. See, we're having a debate on wind, solar, etc. in the chat. I will come back to climate change and energy in a future episode. I'll need to finish the reading list I've got on that, though, which is quite significant, but it's clearly an issue that we need to engage with more seriously. We can't just be continually tail-ending the bourgeois environmentalists who are just Malthusian maniacs. So Peter says, it would have been rather difficult for Stalin to be a tree-loving hippie preaching love and peace when the imperialists and their traitors at home were trying to exterminate the new communist state. This is exactly correct. Of course, the bourgeoisie know very well what they were doing. They know that they were out to destroy the new workers' state, and they were out to do that from the very beginning. The unforgivable thing, of course, is the Trotskyites and the anarchists and others who, on some level, do know. Well, the Trotskyites, at least, I think, the more intelligent of them know that the bourgeoisie were constantly out to destroy the Soviet state, and that you could only have that state survive if you had a very strong dictatorship of the proletariat and a strong workers' state. And yes, that's going to create a bit of a mess sometimes, which is what you got with Yagoda and Yezhov, both of whom were involved in anti-state conspiracies and unleashed a purge that did kill thousands of people, many of whom shouldn't have been. And that's clearly a mistake, which can be attributed to all kinds of things. But unfortunately, that was the nature of the very real war against the Soviet Union that was going on at the time. Like, the ugly stuff was done to the USSR perpetually, right up to the bitter end. And Stalin appreciated what you needed to do to have the revolution survive. He also said at one point, I believe it's in an interview with H.G. Wells, that if the Soviet Union goes, the entire world proletariat will suffer a setback for over a generation. And how right he was with regard to that point. Look at our own situation now and how things have worked out. So, Red Star Betty says, Stalin was a realist and completely and ideologically practically committed to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Workers had no better ally. Very correct. Peter agrees with Red Star Betty, says he's a misguided former trot. Well, there's many former trots, I suspect, around, including me. It's only a mistake if you don't correct it. Betty says she used to be a centre-right libertarian. Well, we all make our errors, so to speak. So, moving on then to the next question. Well, it's a question that comes in two parts from Irish Partisan and reads as follows. What do I think about Putin's comments, re warning Poland on any pretensions on Belarus and Ukraine? Well, very interesting statement that came recently from Putin, where he was making comments in the Security Council meeting, the Russian Security Council meeting, in a conversation with Naryshkin, the head of all the Russian intelligence services. And what he was talking about there was, of course, the plans of Poland to occupy what's now Western Ukraine, essentially rebuild the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which hasn't existed for over 200 years. So clearly the Russians are aware of this plan because the Poles haven't exactly been hiding it. And so Putin made some comments revisiting history with regard to Poland, which of course gained from the weakness of the early Soviet Union and was able to claim territory in what was then Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, and incorporate that into a new Polish state. Putin also said that the Poles played their role in dismembering Czechoslovakia, and they did. They did a deal with Hitler to seize part of the Silesian section of old Czechoslovakia. That's true, they did that. And this, of course, all went on in the period when Poland was run by the dictatorship of Józef Pilsudski, and then it was followed up by a similarly but more parliamentary-based Bonapartist regime, which was more anti-German but also more anti-Semitic. So Poland, in between the World War I and World War II, was run by a series of ultra-reactionaries who, in the case of Pilsudski, was very close to Nazism, and in the case of his successors, were very close to a form of like ultra-right-wing Polish nationalism that was virulently anti-Semitic. And as I've covered before, when it came to the question of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the defeat of Poland by the Nazis in 1939, the Poles were approached by the Soviet Union over and over again about forming a joint front against the Nazis. They refused every single offer, and this is where we get into familiar territory, and this is also something that Putin mentioned. The British and the French were making all kinds of promises to Poland that they will come to their aid no matter what. And what happened when the Nazis attacked? Nothing. They didn't do anything. The British and the French sat there in France and made one sortie over the German border when the German military was almost fully committed to the campaign in Poland. The French could have mobilized themselves, the British could have done, they could have gone in and stormed into Western Germany and created real problems for Hitler. But they didn't. Now, why is that? Is the interesting question. And just to divert into World War II history for a while, it is, of course, because they hoped that once the Nazis had gone into Poland, that they would then roll straight into the Soviet Union, and the two sides, the communists and the Nazis, would fight each other, and then the winner would be so horrifically weakened that it would be relatively easy pickings for the British and the French to destroy. They really hoped that the Nazis destroyed the Soviets, and then they would be able to fairly easily pick off the Nazis. This proved to be a catastrophic error of judgment. Stalin and the Soviet leadership outsmarted the imperialists, did a temporary deal with the Nazis, a non-aggression pact, which they knew very well that the Nazis would break. Hitler kept saying that he'd break it over and over again, and it gave them almost 2 more years to further build up their armed forces. Still not enough to withstand the initial Nazi assault, but enough to resist and put in enough resistance to eventually turn this around. And there's also, of course, expanding the industrial base so it could be then also moved very quickly far east of the mountain ranges in mid-Russia. So the point about all of this is that the way in which the Poles conducted themselves between the two world wars was extremely reactionary. They were looking actively to grab land from anybody who was in political difficulty, and for a long time they were collaborators with Hitler. So Putin's right to make those points. Of course, the Poles then went nuts and protested and screamed, and you got to laugh at the nerve of the Warsaw reactionaries, who are continually screaming and going nuts about the Russians, when they've been sending men to fight and die in eastern Ukraine / Western Russia for over a year now. They're the ones calling for Ukraine to be dismembered under the banner of friendship. And Putin made the correct point. He says if the Poles send troops into Western Ukraine, it will be to occupy it. It will be to dismember it. And he warned the madmen in Warsaw and said, if you have got designs on Belarus, if you attack Belarus, under the terms of the Union State Treaty, you will be attacking the Russian Federation directly, and therefore we will attack you directly, was the implication in his statement there, which of course sent the Poles nuts even further, because many of them did think, and this is why they backed Tikhanovskaya, the wretched comprador who the West picked out to be the leader if they managed to get rid of Lukashenko. The Poles were hoping that, of course, she would destabilize Belarus to the point where it fell apart, and then they could send in troops to occupy the old parts, Polish, as they would see it, parts of Belarus. So the reason why they back people like Zelensky and Tikhanovskaya is because many in the Polish reactionary circles who run Poland now want these countries to collapse so they can seize bits of them. And the other thing Putin mentioned, of course, was the fact that the current Polish border was decided by an agreement between the Soviet Union and the Americans at the end of World War II, which included giving land that used to be for a long time part of unified Germany or the old German states, and saying that that was now part of Poland. And of course this prompted furious protests from the Poles, and the Germans were obliged to make a statement saying that we will stand with Poland no matter what. But you don't have to go back too far to see the reality, which is back in the Cold War when the CDU, Christian Democratic Union in Germany, was issuing election literature. It would routinely show the desire to reclaim the areas of Poland that were formerly Germany. That was an ambition of so-called moderate conservatives in Germany for a very long time, and even with the end of the Cold War and their devouring of the old socialist Germany and the restoration of capitalism in Poland, those dreams still float around German reactionary circles. And Olaf Scholz may deny it all he likes, but Putin understands that there are those in Germany who do desire to reopen the question of where exactly the border lies. And so what Putin's doing there is he's issuing two warnings to the Poles. Firstly, don't dream of sending your troops into Western Ukraine unless, of course, and this was unspoken, you have a deal with us, which I think could have happened at some point. But looking at it now, I'm more and more convinced that the ultimate end of this is the Russians going all the way up to Lvov. And even though Putin said he didn't want to get involved in Western Ukraine, I think by basically telling the Poles, if you go there, it's war, that to me says that they've decided just to take the whole thing. And that is apparently what Putin said privately in a meeting with the Wagner commanders recently as well. And with this warning to the Poles, it seems that any prospect of a deal between the two of them has gone out the window. So looks like they're going to take the whole thing, and this is them warning the Poles off. The Poles, as I've always said, won't move on this without the guarantee that they're not going to get shot at. Because Poland exists as an American protectorate. That's what it has essentially existed as since 1991. And there was a very revealing comment made by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's a Keynesian, I think, mainly, who was an advisor to the post-1989 Polish government, the pro-capitalist government, that was looking for a bailout, essentially, to stop the Polish zloty collapsing in the early 90s. And Sachs said, basically, he went to Bob Dole, and then they spoke to I think it was George H.W. Bush, as his national security advisor, Scowcroft, and they approved a loan of just over $1 billion to essentially stabilize the Polish zloty. And this is followed, of course, by a large amounts of subsidy coming from the EU and a lot of investment from the outside. And this is investment that is all being made by Germany and American imperialism to do what? To make sure that Poland's a thriving capitalist nation? No, not really. It's to make sure that Poland is thoroughly incorporated into the American imperialist structure in order that when the time comes, it can be used against the Russians. Because as Sachs also revealed in that interview that he did with the Duran channel, the same arrangement was, of course, denied for the Russians. No surprises as to why that was, but also that they were keen on bringing the Poles in, and they were bringing the Poles in for that exact reason. That ultimately these would be a useful tool to have for purposes of usage against the Russian Federation, and that's ultimately another thing that Putin said, which was that the plan of the Americans was to then throw the Poles in. And if the Polish people, the Polish masses, think for one moment that their rulers are any better than Zelensky, then they are profoundly wrong. Given the only thing that would be keeping the Polish reactionaries from going down this line is the fact that the domestic response of the Poles seems to be very unfavorable towards it at this stage, and they would not survive electorally if they did. However, if the United States did choose to make a war out of it, I think they could push the Polish reactionaries into going for it very quickly, and they'd use the same method they did with the desperate crew in Kiev, which is tell them, we've got your back, anything you need, just name it. Maybe not direct American involvement, but we're here for you all the way. Maybe the Polish reactionaries are just about intelligent enough to work out that with you all the way means we're with you up to the edge of the cliff and then we'll throw you over it. I at least hope they're intelligent enough to make that judgment. But yes, very interesting comments from Putin, and reveals more about how this might end. So, second question from Irish Partisan here is, what do I make of the arrest of Igor Girkin, a.k.a. Strelkov? If you don't know who Strelkov is, he's the pen name of I think he was a reservist in the FSB. He fought in Chechnya in the 90s. I think he's in his late 40s, early 50s. And he went over the border into Donbass in 2014 and made a name for himself running a militia that managed to run the Ukrainians out of Slavyansk for a number of months actually, and hold on to that for a while. So he got legendary status in Donbass because of that for a while. However, he's an ultra reactionary. He's like a czarist, ultra orthodox in terms of ultra orthodox church, a man who has become ever more hysterical in his commentary regarding the war. Some of which he's been right about the need for the Russians to ultimately mobilize, but he's also then done things like he started calling Putin a coward and a liar, and I think Putin's many things, but a coward I wouldn't say is one of them. Basically screaming for ever greater mobilization, and got to do it now. And eventually the Russian authorities look to have got sick of this and have arrested him. I think he'll probably be thrown in the tank for a few days, given a warning, and let go again. Because ultimately, according to most of the sources in Russia that seem to be trustworthy on this, he doesn't have a mass following. He may have been well thought of 9 years ago, but that's a long time ago. Things have moved on considerably since then. And the overwhelming sympathies amongst the people in Donbass is not for the politics of Igor Girkin, this sort of ultra-reactionary czarist nostalgia. It's much more for their old Soviet homeland, which was the primary influence amongst those who founded the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. So I think Girkin will probably be let go after a little while. I think it's the government basically wrapping his knuckles, and they'll probably release him again. But I certainly don't think he has much of a following in Russia anymore. Certainly not not as much as he did. I think his hysteria and over-the-top pronouncements have probably blown what sympathy was there for him. So, right, we've got a number of things coming in here in the chat, but I'll work through the pre-submitted questions first. Ash asked in the Telegram group what I thought of the British/Kazakh grifter Konstantin Kisin proclaiming that communism was actually worse than fascism. Well, I'll say to that, well, if you don't know who Konstantin Kisin is, he's this, again, like he's a guy who was born in I think he's about the same age as me. He grew up in Kazakhstan in the 80s. His father was something to do with Yeltsin and the privatization schemes in the 90s. So his father's a crook, basically. And like many crooked swines from this particular period, he ends up in London. And Konstantin Kisin emerged a couple of years ago as like some anti-woke guy, the usual shit from like these right-wingers. And then, of course, when the special military operation started, he started proclaiming that he was like the Russia whisperer. He knew how to see inside the mind of the Russians, even though the guy's, I think he's been in London for over 25 years. So what he knows about his homeland, who knows? Presumably he still speaks Russian. Then again, anybody who's got a Telegram account can read a Russian source these days. So he's basically a grifter. He tells the British ruling class what they want to hear about the dastardly Putin. And the only value which men like that have is that if they're starting to say things like this, you can see that the audience that he has within British bourgeois circles is moving in this direction, as they always have. Previously, when the Soviet Union existed, they had to pretend that, of course, fascism was the worst thing in the world, never again, and all that shit, despite the fact that they were constantly working with and funding fascist groups inside the former Soviet Union, and funding groups that were at least as bad as fascists all over the world. So they had to engage in a pretense, though, when the Soviet Union was around. They don't anymore. And so now the British ruling class are facing a severe domestic problem in crisis of profitability, potential economic collapse. It is no surprise that the attempt to rehabilitate fascism is an intellectual enterprise in which they are engaged. And this is how it goes. They go from saying fascism, never again, to saying, well, fascism and communism were twin evils. Remember, that was the line that all the Eastern European reactionaries were taking 20 years ago when they first joined the EU. And now it's, well, communism is worse than fascism. And soon, when they get more workers taking an interest in communism again, which will happen, it will be, well, This is why we became fascists. That will be the next stage in this intellectual development from this sort of layer of bourgeois grifters who are just reflecting what their audience wants to hear. Soon their audience will want to hear reasons why they should be fascists. And at that point, I'm sure Mr. Kissin and his friends will be on hand to tell them why this new union of British fascists is necessary to act as a shield of civilization against the ghastly proletariat and probably the machinations of the Chinese Communist Party or something like that. But this is the way the bourgeoisie develops. When they're in crisis, they are never more than 2 steps away from embracing fascism, and their intellectual lightweights and grifters like Kissin will reflect that. Basically, he's a scumbag. He's a low-rent, petty scumbag who has grifted his way into this position. And by the way, he has nothing but contempt for his audience. The ludicrous things that he says about, like, the Soviet Union and Russia, you can tell he's making this shit up. He's like a male version of Yeonmi Park, the DPRK defector, whose stories got too wild even for the Washington Post. Yeah, scumbag, grifter, dirtbag, horrendous individual, a man who would happily slap on a new British Union of Fascists outfit and say, look over there, go get that guy. If you want a film about guys like that, go watch Bernardo Bertolucci's film from the early 1970s that is entitled Il Conformista, The Conformist, starring a number of actors who you'll recognize from, like, The Godfather. One of the heavies in it is like the Don in Godfather 2. And the lead actor in it is a very fine actor from, like, French movies and Italian movies from the 60s and 70s called Jean-Louis Trintignant. Great film, one of Bertolucci's finest. But that is who the likes of Kissin are. They are the ultimate, like, petty bourgeois conformists with whatever the hell it is that the bourgeoisie is demanding of them at any moment in time. Scumbag, absolute scumbag. So, moving on, away from denunciations, to next question, which is from CJ. Can you explain how bourgeois economists justify their claim that value arises out of circulation? Well, your question is a good one, CJ, and it relates to the fact that bourgeois economists make claims which they often don't substantiate. So, the standard claim as to how value is generated by bourgeois economists, if you look at, like, economic textbooks that are taught at universities very badly, as it turns out, is, of course, they use the standard thing about how, well, it's all about supply and demand. If there's a demand for something, some enterprising individual will create a supply for it, and then if there's too much of it, then the demand will go down, the price will go down, and it's all about the circulation of commodities. That's why, and the demand for them, and that's why price is as it is. It's all about the demand, and about what a seller can, a maker of these commodities can sell it at in an open marketplace, and that's how they justify it. They justify it very loosely on the basis of the old supply and demand theory. And it really doesn't get much more complicated than that. Some of them go into, for instance, I mean, reason why when you're looking at this, you wouldn't even be looking at, like, the classical political economists like Smith and Ricardo, both of whom investigated the labor theory of value and stated that essentially that this was true, that labor was the source of all value. So you're looking then at, like, later economists who would claim that it was all about the supply and demand of commodities and the circulation within the marketplace that creates the value. But essentially what you're exposing in your question is that a lot of this bourgeois economic thought isn't actually very deep and doesn't actually go into anything. It's a series of rather blithe assertions. And it's why, of course, they don't teach very much of what Adam Smith actually wrote in The Wealth of Nations or what Ricardo actually wrote. What they teach is essentially watered-down versions of Hayek and Friedman. And Hayek, I would argue, is much more of a philosopher than an economist. So bourgeois economics now exists on blithe assertions, which are fairly easily disproved. And if you're looking for sense in there, you may be looking rather a long time, because they come up with all kinds of graphs in their textbooks about why, if there's this much supply and this much demand, profit is this, and this is how the capitalist system is continually able to keep changing, because the market is a brilliant indicator and measurer of human needs, and creates new markets according to what those needs are. Of course, a lot of it is guff. A lot of it is just, again, assertions. And this is what you find when you dig into bourgeois economics. There's really not a lot there now. Because, again, they're not relying on Adam Smith or David Ricardo. If you go to, like, the Institute of Economic Affairs or any of those, like, libertarian think tanks, they're not even looking at the classical political economists anymore. It's all bastardized versions of stuff from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So bourgeois economics is junk now. Like, you should still read, just for reference points, like Hayek or Friedman if you want to learn about their arguments. But the bourgeois economics as it's taught now isn't even as good as Hayek or Friedman. It's abysmal. So again, what do they try to prove? They try to prove things just by assertion now. And given that the system is so manifestly falling apart all around them, they have to make even wilder assertions. So, right, I'm going to catch up now with the various questions in the chat. I know I've got one more to get to. Right. Sardino, comrade, can you summarize the Polish communist movement between World War I and World War II? And immediate post-World War II, please. I'm interested in understanding the organic popularity of communism in Poland. Well, between World War I and World War II, the legal Communist Party of Poland was legal only briefly. It was very much suppressed. Most of its leadership in the 30s ended up being in exile in Moscow. Most of its leadership, a lot of its leadership were Polish Jews. One of the most prominent Polish communists, of course, wasn't principally active in Poland. It was Rosa Luxemburg. But there was a communist underground in Poland. The party had to be refounded because of the enormous amount of repression that had been unleashed by Pilsudski. So by the time you get to World War II, Polish communism is mainly an underground movement, though it does have some roots in the working class and the peasantry. After World War II, and remember, in World War II itself, just over, I believe, 300,000 Poles fought with the Red Army as part of the Polish People's Army. That's, of course, more than fought with the British and the Americans on the Western Front. And communism in Poland, like in many other places, became popular in the post-World War II environment because it was the case that the capitalists had basically abandoned ship and run away. Like, the Polish government prior to World War II was screaming all this nationalistic stuff about defending Poland to the last man. They didn't even guarantee a continuity of government. They quit and ran away and went into exile. They got interned in Romania, I believe. And so the reputation of the bourgeois Polish parties after World War II was ruined. So you get in Poland the establishment of, and in Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, you get these people's fronts established with communists, social democrats, and peasant parties. And that's what was established in Poland. Now, I will be returning to the people's democracies at some point soon. But it's fair to say that the communism was on a rising tide of popularity in Poland. In those early days of the early planned economy in the people's democracy, it was incredibly popular because they were rebuilding a nation that had been ruined and nearly destroyed by Nazism. Now, in Poland, things go wrong, I'd say, probably from the late 50s, early 60s onwards, where you get revisionism coming in. And of course, the big, gigantic problem that comes into Poland is, and not just Poland, but also Hungary and especially Yugoslavia, is that they all join the International Monetary Fund and they start taking loans from American imperialism, which is what leads to the crisis, or contributes heavily to the crisis of the 70s, which leads to working class uprisings due to the fact that the government's essentially driven the economy into a ditch because they've taken this short-term option around loans to increase the availability of things like consumer goods in Poland, following the lead of Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, and made a absolute mess of it. So that's when you get Polish working class resistance against the party in the state. It's where ultimately you get the growth of Solidarność come from. It's because of these catastrophic errors, and also the fact that the Polish party did not follow, or was not following, according to the research I've done, the kind of mass line policy that would have secured the continual engagement of the masses. They were trying to do the Khrushchev thing, which is they thought they could buy the masses off by essentially depoliticize them by increasing the amount of consumer goods that were available, copying the consumer boom in the West, basically. And that's a catastrophic mistake. And it leads to all the disasters in Poland that ultimately end with the reimposition of capitalism, a full counter-revolution, and of course the absorption of Poland into the American bloc. But there's a lot more to be said about the Polish experience, and I will return to it. Right, now, where did we get to? Where are we? Yes, thank you to Ben for the suggestion. Please like and share the live stream. All right. Peter asks, sorry to break continuity, but could you say something about Bonapartism and how to identify it? Right. Yeah, well, Bonapartism, according to Marx's definition, arises... he's analysing in his works on France in the 1840s and 50s the rise of Louis Napoleon and the construction of a state which, due to a deadlock in the class struggle, is able to raise itself slightly above the regular way in which a bourgeois state is constructed, which is what the Bonapartist state, meaning Louis Napoleon, Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, was able to do in France, and he was able to play off different aspects of the ruling class against each other. So sometimes he would side with the landowners and the peasantry and the financial capitalists against the industrial capitalists. Sometimes he would side with the industrial capitalists against the financial capitalists. Long-term effects of this, according to both Marx and Lenin, was to retard the industrial development of France and to ultimately cause it to be stuck at a level of development that was not near its British rival. So Bonapartism is an attempt by the state now, I would define it as this, to break out of a deadlock in the class struggle and a profound crisis of capitalism by essentially trying to raise the executive of the state above the normal set of class relations and being able to either lean on or dictate to various aspects of the ruling class at certain moments in order to stabilize society. And we are moving more and more in the direction of open Bonapartism in the West, and that will be unsatisfactory for them in terms of resolving their problems, and then will spill over into, well, there's a risk of it spilling over into outright fascism, but that very much depends on how the class struggle develops. If there's a desire for it, I could do an entire live stream about Bonapartism, looking at it through the medium of books like The 18th Brumaire and others. But let me know if you want me to do that. Mediocrities with unbridled power seem to characterize our times in the bourgeois world. Characterize it because that's what the system produces. The system produces degenerated and useless individuals because the system is degenerated and increasingly useless. It's only good at funneling money around, exporting capital out of the country, making sure everybody gets paid on the corporate boards, and then basically screwing the working class. That's all it is required to do. It's why you get pathetic mediocrities like Keir Starmer, brain-dead old men like Joe Biden, or mediocrities like Ron DeSantis, who was made to look like a genius because he simply asked a question of the experts during COVID. Turns out he's not a genius, but he is doing videos with Russell Brand. So good to see that Russell knows what the money is. I hope you can all see me. Right. Gonna carry on because it seems like we're back online again. I trust that was our friends at GCHQ getting in the way. So, gonna try and find where I was again. Yeah, Jonah's point about them using the Nazi Quisling flag and warmly invited to Western academic institutions. It's not surprising, but it is crazy. Yeah, it is not surprising, but again, it's only crazy, and people are so shocked by it, and they should be shocked by it, because you're told from an very early age, growing up in the West, that the Nazism is the worst thing ever, but then your government is shown to be collaborating with it. So clearly they're full of shit. They don't mean it for a second. Nazis and things very much like Nazis are very useful to the bourgeoisie. They're very good foot soldiers. The only thing the bourgeoisie really learnt from World War II is that you shouldn't let the Nazis have that much power, but they'll certainly use them. And Nazis are always the most degenerated and scummy elements of any society, because ultimately, especially in nations like Belarus, what you're going to be called upon to do is to essentially destroy your own nation for the benefits of US imperialism. And you've got to be a degenerated and useless individual to want to do that. So, moving on, Alan Miller. Hello, Alan. What is your take on the significant right-wing electoral gains in Spain, Greece, Italy, Germany, and France? What does it represent? What are the implications for the working class? Well, in brief, I would say if you look at Italy especially, what you've got with Meloni is somebody who is a slavish adherent to the NATO bloc, to the American bloc. She's going to follow all the orders that come from American imperialism on the one hand. On the other hand, it represents an evolution in the Italian ruling classes looking for a way out of the deadlock of Italian capitalism. Italian capitalism was severely damaged by the Eurozone debt crisis, and it has been unable to emerge from that crisis since then. To be honest, it's had a real problem since arguably the 90s, and the Italian working class has rightly been resisting the various attempts by Berlusconi and others to gut all of their terms and conditions. Now the Italian ruling class are moving towards a more and more openly fascist solution. Now, Meloni's not running a fascist regime at the moment. She's still abiding by bourgeois democratic norms, as people like Gianfranco Fini, her predecessor, did when he was in coalition with Berlusconi. Remember that 20 years ago. As did the Freedom Party in Austria, these sort of neo-fascist organizations who came to power via bourgeois elections and sort of amened themselves to the strictures of the EU. But what it represents really is the fact that these governments, so if you look at like Spain, Greece, Italy, they're all these countries which have been in an almost perpetual crisis for nearly 20 years. They were crowbarred into the euro for the benefit of the German bourgeoisie, so that the German bourgeoisie could use their advantage in their strong manufacturing base, and the fact that trade barriers were destroyed, of course, by the imposition of the euro, to destroy a lot of the manufacturing base of Greece, Italy, and Spain in order to grab that market share for themselves, and then lend the southern European countries money so that they could buy German manufactured goods, and then lend them more money to pay off the last loan you gave them. Hence the Greek crisis. So this is one of the problems that is facing the capitalist class in all these countries, that they haven't been able to get out of this crisis. So it is inevitable that due to the catastrophic failure of things like Syriza, things like the Five Star Movement in Italy, and of course the collapse of the Parti Socialiste in France, and the inability of Mélenchon's movement so far to make any kind of convincing breakthrough, the turn of the ruling classes in all of these countries is going to be increasingly towards movements that can more convincingly get the job done. Macron is failing in France. He's failed to restore profitability. He's failed to deliver the bourgeoisie all the things that they want. And so what they're going to be doing is looking for a more strong alternative that can move towards Bonapartism, and then move towards, depending upon the severity of class struggle, ultimately towards fascism. Now, at the moment, what they're looking to do is to build electoral coalitions, bringing in enough of the upper end of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie in order to base the governments on, governments like Meloni, and give them a voting base. Maloney's just the first stage. Now, the drift is going to be towards ever increasingly more dictatorial and Bonapartist rule that is going to be used to crush all resistance from the domestic working class, and of course engage in aggressive acts of imperialism overseas, which also provides the opportunity for some flag waving. But this is coming across Europe because of the depth of the capitalist crisis. The ruling class, if they want to sustain themselves, are going to have to absolutely crush the organizations of the domestic working class. And who's better for that? Well, you need fascism in order to do that. And you need fascism in order to do that because, as I've pointed out many times, relying purely on the state bureaucracy comes with risks, especially if the working class resistance is very high. And you can't use social democratic tactics to crush them or divide them. You need to go and stick the boot in order to take drastic chances to restore profitability. And that's what fascism is for. And it's also for a fake revolution. This is what Hitler did. This is what Mussolini did. They rallied the discontented petty bourgeoisie in the urban and rural settings, and of course the lumpens as well, and converted them into these street militia movements. And then when the call came from the ruling class to form a government, they then incorporated these militia movements into the state structure, thus providing a new source of legitimation for the state structure. Now, whether we have fascism in the form of uniformed street thugs marching around and beating people up, or whether it's a little bit more subtle than that, either way, fascism is in the pipeline. Because of the depth of the crisis, because of the need the ruling class will have to attack the working class and to destroy working class bargaining power even further, this is what's in the post, so to speak. So this is a turn towards ever greater reactionary politics that the bourgeoisie is experimenting in. That's what AfD will be, by the way, in Germany. I know a lot of people are saying, oh my God, they're anti-American. No, they're not. They're going to go down the Maloney route. They're going to go down the Maloney route and they'll be told what to do by the German ruling class, which is bust up the working class and grovel to the Americans. And basically then engage in some right-wing, ultra-reactionary culture war politics to try and solidify a good, solid supporter base for yourself. That's where the AfD is going. Whether it will be adequate to the crisis in front of it, because there's a big crisis coming for German capitalism, that's another question. But the implication for the working class, to finish up with Alan's question, will be that working class organisation needs to dramatically improve, and it needs to improve very quickly, because the level of working class industrial and political organisation in all of these countries now is abysmal. Syriza, disastrous. The KKE, good at making gestures, not very good at anything else. Spanish communists, hopelessly compromised by their association with the PSOE, basically the Spanish Labour Party. There is an attempt to rebuild the communist parties or the communist movement in Italy. I hope that can be strengthened and succeed. And in the case of Britain, well, we need to get on with it as well. There needs to be a new movement to essentially wrestle control of the unions away from the current generation of leaders, or if that's not adequate and we get enough of a grassroots movement, then to break those unions apart and form new ones, if there's enough of a mass movement behind that demand. So it means we've got to up our activity and to recognize the depth of the crisis that we're in, to answer your question, Alan. Peter says, great question. I half recall a quote from Walter Benjamin, every rise of a fascism represents a failure of the left. With Yanis Varoufakis and his ex-party as the Greek left, in a Greek left, I see his point. Very true. Cosmos says, Putin is not a coward, but he's certainly risk-averse. I would say yes, in many respects. Putin's prepared to take a risk when he's certain, as far as he can be, of the outcome, or he's pushed into a position where he can't do anything else. So, yeah, I agree he's risk-averse, but Gherkin saying that he's a coward, I think he's just Gherkin sounding off out of his own frustrations. Kissing is the British version of Paul Mazzaro. Yes, good comparison, Irish Partisan. Irish Partisan says, Edvard Gerich elected to borrow billions from the IMF in the early 70s in order to buy the population off with consumer goods. Yeah, that's exactly the point I was making. All of these countries basically tried to go in the direction of depoliticizing the proletariat and buying them off and getting them soaked with consumer goods so that they'd essentially leave the bureaucracy alone. The exact opposite choice should have been made. They should have actually gone further in the direction of establishing the mass involvement of the proletariat with the party. They should have re-established or properly established the practice of the mass line. They should have dramatically upped the cultural and educational level of the workers in order that they could play a part in the governing of the state and the party itself. So all of this is what should have been done, and what was done instead, not just in Poland, but also in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, was that the bureaucracy took a rightward opportunistic turn and kept trying to buy the population off. They kept trying to compete with the capitalists on the same basis that the capitalists were trying to pacify the population in the West via consumerism. The bureaucrats and the revisionists in the East were trying to do the same thing, to disastrous effect, because essentially you're trying to sustain a system based on the collective ownership of the means of production and a workers' state, and you're trying to treat it like you're trying to build capitalism. You're essentially going to introduce a fundamental contradiction in the base of that society, which is going to rip it apart, which it did within 20 years of Geirik doing that. Talk on Bonapartism sounds interesting, says Jerry. Okay, well, I'll put it on the list. Peter says he's dusting off his copy of 18th Brumaire. Okay. Red Star Betty says, finding out about the British government supporting fascists in Ukraine was a major factor in sending me back to my teenage socialist ideas. It really disabused me of my libertarian naivety. Yeah. Once you discover that the involvement of the British and the American government with fascism, there's no real going back, because once you discover that everything you're told about the evils of fascism is something that the British ruling class themselves never really believed. And so if they're bullshitting about World War II and why it was fought and what it was fought over, well, then what else are they bullshitting about? Turns out it's everything. So I'll move on to the next question. Next question is from Lee Hinchcliffe, a man in Sheffield. So he asks, how do you think the current situation in Syria may play out in light of a Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, the role of Turkey, and the close proximity of both Russian Federation and US forces? So if you're not familiar with what's going on, the role of the US in Syria is essentially what Trump said it was. It's, we're going to be there to steal the oil. Again, Trump having an outburst of truth. And the US troops are there in alliance, it must be said, with the Kurdish forces, which is why Erdogan has got such a big problem with them being there. And they are looking to shore up their position there. This is partly why they did that 3,000-strong call-up recently. They're looking to strengthen their forces in the Middle East. Now, this might be, and there's a lot of speculation about this, because they want to shore up their position in Syria and make sure that their operation there is sustainable, and because there's not that many of them there, and that they don't essentially allow the Syrian government to reunite the country. So there's that. The other speculation is that they may be looking to cause trouble in the Persian Gulf and look to exert pressure on this peace deal that was signed between the Saudis and the Iranians, and look to make sure that there's a falling out there. Now, of course, there's always constant tensions there because there are border disputes. The Iranian government claims a lot of islands that the UAE also claims. The Russians are trying to keep the Saudis and the Emirates on sides. They agreed, at least partially, with the UAE's claims over those islands. The Iranian government threw a fit. Now there's a big row. I suspect the Russians will be working overtime to smooth that over. There's various things that the Americans could be trying to do here. Again, like cause problems between the Saudi Arabians and Iran, break up that peace deal. That's a big motivator for them. And also the other thing is they could be looking to stage some dramatic reassertion of American imperial power in the Middle East, because it's fairly clear now that they're not going to be able to fight the Russians in Ukraine, that they don't want to. So they need to find an easier target in the question when it comes to trying to reassert themselves. They can't go to war against China. That's not going to work. They can't go to war against Russia. So what could they do? Is it a risk that they could try some kind of insane bombing campaign over Iran? I can't see that, to be honest, because, again, that would necessitate them flying planes close enough to Iran to fire missiles into it. Could they be thinking that they go on and strike Iranian nuclear facilities, or that which the Americans claim are nuclear facilities? It's possible, but the Iranian government seems, to my viewing of the situation, to have more than enough military capability to shoot down US aircraft and to do severe damage to any US ships that are in the Persian Gulf. And this was war gamed out 20 years ago. And the prediction that the Americans came up with in that scenario was that they would lose an encounter in the Persian Gulf and would need to go to like full-scale mobilization in order to pull off a victory. And I don't think the Americans can stage any kind of invasion of Iran. They don't have the manpower to do it. Again, the calculation is they've only got 250,000 men that they could possibly mobilize if they emptied out every base on the planet and stuck them all in one place. So I don't think some kind of invasion of Iran is a very likely prospect. They'd far rather rely on sanctions and rely on trying to create internal problems if they possibly can. So I think it's much more to do with trying to put forces in there to create a situation, to break up, if they can create some tensions between the Saudis and the Iranians, break up that peace deal. That's one of the options they're looking at. But the other thing is to shore up their place in Syria to make sure they don't get driven out of that. So that's probably why they're mobilizing. That's probably why they're putting more forces in the area. Now, Lee's point about the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, well, that's another part of the reason why they're putting more forces there. They fear that if the Saudis and the Iranian government agree on some kind of bargain over Syria, because of course Assad has been accepted back into the Arab League now, so clearly the Saudis have now re-recognized the Assad government. The Saudis and the Iranians may then agree with the Russians on a solution there, and the Americans will want to block that. Doing whatever they possibly can to do it. They're probably going to try and use the Kurds, which will be another case of the Kurds being used and then discarded again when things turn in another direction. So there's some attempt there to reassert themselves, to also make life more difficult for the Russians by getting them to potentially commit more forces to Syria. So they're looking for other areas to unbalance their enemies in, basically, be it in the Persian Gulf for the Iranians, be it in northern Syria for the Russians, and of course using proxies wherever they can. I still don't think they're going to commit themselves to any direct attack on anybody. They'll use the Kurdish population as far as they possibly can to create problems in Syria, and if that means that Assad speeds up his bargain with Erdogan to crush and destroy them, I don't expect the Americans will come riding to their rescue anytime soon. So again, this is all positional warfare, essentially hybrid warfare that is going on, all designed to shore up their position and to unbalance their enemies in the Middle East however they can, and to bring back the Saudis into their camp if they possibly can, though that's unlikely with the current leadership. Whether the Americans have some kind of palace coup in mind for Saudi Arabia, that is an interesting question. I am sure that the CIA is working overtime on finding a candidate to replace MBS with, because if the progress the Chinese and the Russians have made in talking or persuading the Saudis over into a more nuanced position, away from just being solely dependent on the Americans, that is something that the Americans will very much want to reverse. So, moving then to another question before we get to other things from the chat. JB comments on Patreon, do you think there is an actual hope of communism for half or more of the global population in the next 50 years? Interesting question. I would say that, well, let's talk about communism. I mean, communism is the end stage. It's the stage where we get to the fact that the mode of production is, or the forces of production are so advanced, the means of production has got to such a point of development that we are no longer suffering from any kind of shortages, that the culture and of and educational level of the masses has reached the point where they are the true masters of society, where the imperialists have been weakened to the point where they can no longer threaten any socialist system, and you can start to move away from a workers' state into being, to use the old phrase, in a system where the workers are just administering things and it's no longer a recognizable state format. So I don't think we're going to see that anywhere in the world in the next 50 years. I think there is more than a chance of seeing a move to workers' states or people's democracies in many areas of the world in the next 50 years. Certainly, I hope that the Chinese reach their objective of a moderately prosperous socialist society within the next few years. By the time of their 100th anniversary of the revolution, I think that's their objective. And I think there's a chance of a revival of communist parties, a real revival in the imperialist nations, particularly the European nations, where there's a strong tradition of it within living memory. And even in the United States itself, I think there's a chance, because this is the depth of the crisis which the ruling class, as I said before when I'm talking about the rise of the right-wingers, the rise of the so-called right-wing populists, there's a chance, a good chance of a revival of communism in the working class, because of the level of attacks that the ruling class will have to do upon the working class in order to restore profitability, and the fact that the system is just in this deep and long-lasting crisis through which there is no real way out other than the ruling class using direct repression or instigating World War III or something like that. The depth of the crisis means that there will be a call for answers. The masses will demand answers. And one of the things that is positive at the moment is that the bourgeois press is declining in its ability to provide adequate cover stories. More and more people don't trust it. They're not turning towards communism just yet, but they are openly questioning the bullshit that is coming to them through the BBC, through CNN, through the usual bourgeois propaganda channels. So I think there's every chance of a revival of communist parties very soon. And I think there's every chance of a revival of the old system of people's democracies within, if I had to put a time on it, which I'm reluctant to do, I'd say within the next 20 years, there's a good chance of us having opportunities to overthrow capitalism in some of the what were previously regarded as major capitalist nations. That's the depth of the rot. The mood of anger is clearly there in many of these societies. It's incoherent. It bounces around all over the place, as you saw in France recently, but it's there, running under the surface. What needs to happen is the development of communist parties that can start to organize the advanced elements of the class, and then we can see some real progress. But yes, I'm confident in a communist revival, but I don't think we're going to get to end-state communism at any point in the next 50 years in any society until, of course, imperialism itself is thoroughly dealt with to the point where it can no longer be a threat. So, Irish Partisan asks, what do you think of the current spat between Jimmy Dore and Kyle Kalinske? Dore said that Trump is the lesser of two evils between Trump and Biden. Kalinske threw a fit and challenged Dore to a debate. Jesus. Trump the lesser evil. I don't agree with that point of view. I think I think that there is a lot of people who project things onto Trump that aren't there. Trump says 5 contradictory things in each sentence. Trump will say, I'm going to end the wars. Then he'll say, and I'm going to do it by being tough and increasing military spending. I mean, I think people like Jimmy Dore and others are seeing what they want to see in Trump. I've listened to an entire Trump speech, and again, if you can point out a single commitment that is solid in anything that he says, you'd be lucky. Yeah, you can clip a Trump speech to make it look as if he's saying something that's anti-war, and he generally had the instincts to want to avoid like a disaster in Iran. He did say no to that, but look at what he did in Ukraine to secure his position inside the Republican Party, which even if he wins again, it's going to be the same Republican Party. Yes, you have some sort of oddballs in there like Marjorie Taylor Greene who try and blockade to Ukraine. But by the way, all these people are completely committed to war in China, or war with China, so to speak. So again, like the idea of Trump as the lesser evil, I think is dumb, to be blunt. And I think Kalinski's dumb as well, because first of all, because of what he's done to his hair. Kyle, trust me, as a man who has lost his, accept it and stop painting your head livid yellow. It's a very poor decision. But the idea that Biden is the lesser evil is just ridiculous. Look, the continuity from Obama to Trump to Biden is the most interesting and pertinent fact here. The policy of Obama, which was really just the American permanent states policy, which is to arm Ukraine and set it up as essentially a force to be used against Russia. Trump continued that policy, principally to save his own political skin, not out of deep principle. And Obama didn't oppose that policy because it was his way of securing his political skin. He didn't want the deep state to turn on him and the Democratic Party to turn on him. And Biden has followed through on that policy and created a hell in Ukraine. And Trump will come in saying 8 different contradictory things and end up bumbling towards a further tension with the Chinese and probably continuing to ramp up more war tensions with the Russians. Because Trump fundamentally is this sort of lower bourgeois clown, essentially. Like, he has a few instincts which people respect, and like people get behind him because he calls all the establishment figures fools and insults them, and that's funny. But what did he do in office? I mean, look at all the things he did. Well, like with the Israelis, like giving them everything they could want on a transactional basis, because he thought that Netanyahu would secure for him the entire Jewish vote in America, which is a bit of a laugh. But again, like in every single case, Trump like doubled down or made things worse. And there's a series of people out there who want to see in Trump the prospect of some kind of break with NATO. And again, Trump talked about this, but he didn't do any of it. He did the opposite. He made things worse. So no, I don't buy the idea for a second that Trump is a lesser evil. Trump is a man who says, again, 5 different contradictory things in each sentence, and he's incapable of overcoming the institutional opposition. Because when faced with the institutional power of the American state, what did Trump do? Rolled over and died, because they were investigating his family, and he was never going to lead some kind of populist revolt against this deep state he keeps talking about, but he doesn't do anything about it. He's not going to do anything about it next time either, even if he does win. So no, neither of these are the lesser evil. They're both an evil from the perspective of the proletariat, and we shouldn't indulge people saying you should vote for Trump, just as we shouldn't indulge anybody who says you should vote for Biden. That's opportunistic crap in both directions. And just as I wouldn't indulge anybody who tells me that Keir Starmer is the lesser evil, or indulge anybody who told me that you got to vote for Rishi Sunak. This is all nonsense. The whole system is rotten. There is an audience of working class people out there who are ready to hear that the system is rotten and you can't vote your way out of this. So let's take them that message. Let's not sow illusions in Donald fucking Trump. My God. I thought Dore was a bit more intelligent than that. HM asks, is it bad practice for a communist to support the England national football team? Asking for a friend. By a friend, do you mean yourself? Be honest now. No, I don't think it is. I think, look, national football teams and national sporting events, look, you can argue that people who fly an England flag outside of their door have poor taste in football teams, but in reality, like, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything other than that you want the team that is associated with the country you either live in or grew up in to win. It doesn't automatically translate into like rabid national chauvinism or anything like that. You want to support the England football team? Go right ahead. You'll be disappointed, because they always disappoint. It's not a politically meaningful thing. Like, yeah, I know that there are some people who like in the England football fan base who are like petty bourgeois football hooligans, or like lumpens with bizarre opinions and theories on race and all that kind of shit. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't go around judging people politically based on them waving the England flag or wearing an England football shirt. That's nonsense. If you want to support a particular football team, go ahead and do it. Doesn't necessarily mean anything. Just like it's not particularly it's not particularly meaningful as to someone's actual politics, what films they watch or what music they listen to. This is all like lifestylist, consumerist judgments that come out of like the last few decades. It's all junk, should be discarded. Sport is sport. Enjoy it if you want to. You'll never enjoy the performances of the England football team, however. They're shite, and they'll always be shite. Right, Peter, glad you enjoyed the live stream. I think, unless I've missed something, that we are at the end of the questions list. So we're clocking in at about 1 hour and 45. I've got a series of notes of other things that people want to investigate. A lot of people want stuff on Bonapartism, people's democracies, etc. So, unless there is anything else that is urgent coming in, I will call it a day, and we'll log off now. And I will thank everybody who's contributed to what's been a really great Q&A today. So I'm going to go through the list. Sardino, thank you to you. Dingo Ate Me Baby, James Graham, Jerry, Lee, Peter, Red Star Betty, Irish Partisan, my comrade Jason, Jonah, HM, Ben Kavanagh. What else we got here? Hello to my comrade Terry, also from the Class Consciousness Project. And hello and thank you to Alan for the question there. And if you haven't checked it out already, be sure to watch the video of my discussion I had at Alan's group that was held last Sunday. I posted that on the Telegram group. Hello to Cosmos, Peter, and I believe that's it. All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for an update on all things Ukraine. And until next time, thank you for tuning in. See you again very soon.